Good morning. Is this too loud? Good morning. Yesterday was an incredible day. Welcome to day 2. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to acknowledge your tremendous participation so far. I realize we don't often have the leisure to talk, listen, reflect, apply, and then maybe even start to take action in the same space within the same day. And so I've enjoyed the experience, and I know that it's only been successful because of your participation. So we'd like to thank you so far and welcome you to day 2. Can you hear me without the microphone? Yeah. That's just great, because I can't be. That's just ridiculous. So my job is to actually remind us a little bit of our agenda. Today we will operate as we did yesterday. We'll have our final keynote speaker, followed by a brief question and answer session, a very brief break. We will then proceed into breakout groups with moderators and note takers, and then come back together to share the results of our breakout groups. We'll then break for lunch, and then we'll reconvene for a final 1-hour session where Paul Marty will walk us through the steps that are yet to come. I have the pleasure of announcing our third and final keynote speaker, Roxanne Shirazi, who is Assistant Professor and Dissertation Research Librarian at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. I've known Roxanne for not even 48 hours, because I'm breaking into storytelling now. But in the first 5 minutes of our first conversation, when she managed to use the words metadata and gendering, feminist critique, and Audre Lorde in the same sentence, I knew we would be kindred spirits. A former Haystack scholar and a frequent attender of that camps, Roxanne is a native Californian transplanted on the East Coast. She's worked at the CUNY Graduate School Nita Reese Library since 2013, and as of January this year, was installed as the new dissertation research librarian, where she manages all aspects of the dissertation and thesis deposit process, develops and documents procedures, manuscript format guidelines, and makes instructional materials. Most significantly, and perhaps most salient to her presentation today, she actually provides one-on-one research consultations and workshop-based instruction on scholarly communication topics to graduate students throughout the dissertation process, not only at the end when they need to document. She's held internships at the Museum of Modern Art and the International Center of Photography. She's completed a fairly significant research project on labor at the Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives at NYU. She's also founding editor, co-editor of DH Plus Live, an online publication and collaborative project sponsored by the Association of College and Research Libraries. In addition to mastering, and I hope someday hopefully confounding, the Library of Congress classification system, Roxanne's scholarship gravitates toward digital sustainability. It's often at the nexus of digital humanities, librarianship, with a special emphasis on scholarly communication, copyright, graduate student research, and digital dissertations. Her current research work projects on digital scholarly editions and digital archives, librarianship as a feminized profession, and the history of the dissertation secretary in graduate studies. Please join me in welcoming Roxanne.
Now I have to figure out the microphone. How's this? Okay, I'm just going to set my timer so I can keep track. Well, I do want to start by saying thank you so much for inviting me here. This has been really kind of a dream come true to have the whole day and a half on this topic. I actually heard of the symposium before I got the invite. I saw it get announced and it was on my radar as something to explore. I'd never been to FSU. I had no idea how I'd get here. And then thankfully I was invited to talk. So, and also thank you so much to Therese for that wonderful introduction and for carting me around and taking me back and forth to the hotel, all of that work that I know has been taking up all of your time for these last 2 days. So thank you. Okay. I have a lot to say. I'd like to begin by reading a passage from sociologist Arlie Hochschild. And this is not what I know her work from, but this is part of a kind of brand new edited volume on invisible labor, which I highly recommend. And she didn't edit the book, but she did contribute a foreword. And the way that it opens, I think, does a really nice job of kind of setting the stage for the discussion today on invisible labor in the digital humanities. And she invites us to imagine that you're walking into an American department store to buy a dress. Quote, "The dress is sewn of cotton grown on the western plains of India, let us say, and harvested by underpaid laborers who are exposed to pesticides. Invisible are the workers who plant, irrigate, pick, clean, compress, tag, store, and bale the cotton, and truck it to factories where it is spun, woven, dyed, and shipped as bolts of cloth, to be then cut and sewn into dresses by workers in overcrowded backstage factories in Bangladesh. It is then tagged, wrapped, and shipped to stores where dresses are unpacked, priced, shelved, hung, and sold. The faces of such workers are hidden behind the labels of garments, Ann Taylor, Ralph Lauren, Urban Outfitters, and others. And the models we see wearing these garments in women's magazines or on company websites, we focus on the blonde model or the brunette, the one in the red dress and the blue. The model becomes a stand-in for what we don't see, the hundreds of people around the globe who produce the dress. And I want us now to think about these words and the labor activities they describe as we followed the product around, and to try to put them in conversation with our usual notions of collaboration. And to do that, I think we need to shift away from the idea of the product, or as we discussed yesterday, the project, and turn our focus to the process. But before we go down that road, I need to tell a story. I'm going to guess that most of you are familiar with the work of the photographer Louis Hein. Oh, sorry. There we go. And probably most of you know his work with the National Child Labor Committee in the 1910s, and the instrumental role that his photographs had in exposing the horrid conditions that these children were working in, whether it was industrial factories or newsboys out on the street. And the standard telling of the Hein trajectory places him as a master of social documentary photography during that progressive period at the turn of the century. He witnessed Ellis Island, child labor, and immigrant communities during the 1910s. He then detoured through formalism in the 1920s, and peaking with the construction of the Empire State Building in 1931, before entering relative obscurity, losing his home, and going on relief until his death in 1940. These are photographs that are probably familiar to you, right? We've all seen these. And the thing about Louis Hein is that he's largely absent from our understanding of the Great Depression, which happened obviously in the 30s. Save for a brief appearance at the end of the 30s when his work was rediscovered by Berenice Abbott and Beaumont Newhall during their work with the Photo League in New York City. When you look at the scholarship around Depression documentary photography, Hein is considered a precursor to that documentary impulse that culminated in the remarkable work of the Farm Security Administration photographers, like Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, and John Vachon. And if you're familiar with Yale's Photogrammer project, a digital humanities project that focuses on these Farm Security Administration photographs, you know how important they are to our collective visual memory of the Depression years. And yet in this history of 30s documentary photography, Hein was an inspiration to their work, but not generally considered of their time. Yet Hein was certainly not absent during the 30s, despite his financial hardships and lack of recognition. He was actually a working photographer, taking assignments with the American Red Cross, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and smaller projects for places like the Montclair Public Library in New Jersey, the New Haven Community Chest, and the New York City Parks Department in the first half of the decade. Then, in 1936, he began working as the chief photographer for something called the National Research Project on Reemployment Opportunities and Recent Changes in Industrial Techniques. Like all good WPA projects, it has an abbreviation, NRP. It was charged with gathering empirical evidence of the impact of technological innovation on unemployment. And headed by an economist named David Weintraub, the project employed over 400 researchers. That's some collaboration. There were economists, statisticians, and sociologists who drew on both field studies and secondary research to examine the effects of new technology and the burgeoning practice of industrial research on the workplace and labor economics. Throughout the 1920s and into the Depression, industrial productivity had been increasing while wages remained stagnant. Does this sound familiar? By 1936, although the massive unemployment of the Great Depression was lessening, it continued to present a problem for the Roosevelt administration. So Hein landed the job of the chief photographer of the National Research Project, the NRP, at a time when his financial situation made him desperate for work. And despite Hein's by then extensive experience documenting working class communities, he'd been rejected by Roy Stryker, the head of the information unit of the FSA. He'd sought to work with that project, but Hein was considered too particular about his artistry to work well with someone as autocratic as Stryker, who carefully constructed the images that were released by the government, and even went so far as to poke holes in the negatives that were unsuitable, or at least that's how the story goes. Hein insisted on keeping control of his own negatives, earning a reputation for behaving as an artist. There's some evidence, in fact, that Stryker may have deliberately sought to erase recognition of Hein's trailblazing work in social documentary photography in order to protect his own claim on the originality and significance of the FSA photographs. So the significance of Hein's contribution to this national research project stemmed from his own concern toward the visibility of manufacturing labor in a society becoming obsessed with consumer products. While the economists and statisticians were concerned primarily with the technology, Hein was concerned with the laborer. And over the course of 6 months, he produced over 700 photographs as he moved across 14 industrial communities, mostly in the eastern United States, capturing not just the technology, but the workers, their surroundings, and their relationship to the work they performed. So here we have an accomplished documentary photographer who is grounded in social responsibility and who cut his teeth in factory exposés, taking photographs of workers' livelihoods and their communities at what was really a tumultuous time for labor. The mid-30s was very active as far as labor unions and strikes go. And it's part of one of the most studied occurrences in U.S. cultural history, the Great Depression. These photographs, we all know them. Yet his photographs are rarely considered when scholars of Depression photography talk about what the 30s looked like. That was a weird transition. Judith Mara Gutman, who is not her, is trying to change that. Gutman is a Hein scholar who was instrumental in turning scholarly attention to Louis Hein with her 1967 publication, Louis Hein and the American Social Conscience. This was the first serious biographical study of the man and his work. It was really groundbreaking at the time. People did not know him as well as we do now. So Gutman has been working on a book that's actually due out later this year, and it's called Louis Hein and the NRP Photographs. This is following on a small exhibition of the photographs that she curated at the International Center of Photography in New York City in 2013. And that's actually how I first found out about these photographs. But it's also not the first time that Gutman has attempted to resurrect this collection that seems to have been forgotten. In the early 80s, she curated a similarly small exhibition at the Photofind Gallery and wrote briefly about them in the New York Times Magazine. Again, this was the early 80s with the flight of manufacturing. She saw these connections to what was in these photographs. But in her early studies of Hein and his earlier progressive era work, Gutman calls attention to the eyes of Louis Hein, the way he photographed, noting as others do that his subjects We're photographed straight on, looking at us. And Gutman talks about the ways in which this contributes to the sense of dignity that is present in those earlier works. Their humanity is evoked through their eyes. They see us seeing them. Yet in Hein's NRP photographs in the 30s, the workers are intent on their materials, their work, and their eyes are locked into their task. Here it is their hands that draw us in, that call attention to their humanity, in opposition to the cold machinery. The common pose of the male worker in these images is hunched over the machine, with rolled sleeves and bare hands. They are not bored or alienated, but invigorated as they perform a tactile maneuvering of the technology, which seems to bend at their will. These photographs, as Gutman notes, are startling for their delicacy. She writes, "It's not that they hailed their products, but rather that they knew them." Indeed, there's a remarkable intimacy revealed through these photographs, an intimacy of the worker and her workplace, the craft and materiality of their labor, the care with which they manipulate their materials. And it speaks to the value that workers place on their role in the production process. And it allows us to see their expertise, however big or small, in their own sphere. And in these photographs from the NRP project, we find the same emphasis on dignity and humanity that is found in Hein's Ellis Island and child labor photographs. And I bring this story of Louis Hein and his move between eyes and hands to get us thinking about that slippage that happens between invisible work and invisible worker. Now the irony, of course, is that this collection of photographs was ultimately forgotten. It was lost in a mountain of research output and overshadowed by the much more extensive work of the FSA. That, at the end of the day, Hein's efforts to expose the invisible human labor behind the mass production of consumer products made no difference whatsoever in the lives of these workers. There was no landmark legislation that passed that magically eliminated technological unemployment. We think about his fight against child labor and the way that that succeeded. It definitely took some time, but there was a tangible success. This, it seems, was Hein's failure. And yet, we have these extraordinary photographs that take on a new relevance for us today as our own relationship with work and employment shifts, as we begin to deal with exploitation in digital labor and automation and robots. We know precisely where he went, what he tried to do, who he worked with, and how his photographs were used. Many were included in reports and pamphlets that were produced as part of that larger research project. It was incredibly well-documented documentary photography, but we'll get to the documentation later. Okay. Moving on to the complexities of invisible work. The concept of invisible work has been discussed from several different angles, from a variety of fields, and I'm going to kind of give a whirlwind tour here today on a couple of areas that I think will be generative to our discussions. Most of my background here comes from a sociological perspective, and in that field, in 1987, Arlene Daniels wrote an article called Invisible Work that really guided the field and directed where they were going to go. So invisible work is work that is unvalued. The relationship between visibility and value is complicated, and they actually interplay in complex ways. Oh, I made a visual. Some work is invisible and devalued, like domestic work and childcare. Other forms of work are highly visible, yet still devalued, like fast food work. Yet other work is invisible and manages to still be highly valued. Think of management and leadership. Note that this work is often coded as male. But we should also bear in mind the distinction between invisible work and invisible workers. Is it the action, the labor process that is invisible? Or are we talking about the workers themselves? So we have a few indicators to look at here. What do we mean by value? Here are some of the ways that value gets expressed. Recognition, remuneration, that would be monetary. Prestige, autonomy. The balance between these is constantly shifting and depends on the goals of the individual and the specific context of the work. In her study on flight attendants and emotion work, Arlie Hochschild is clear to say that there's nothing inherently wrong with emotional labor. The problem is that because it's often invisible, it is not valued as labor. And you don't get these same expressions of value around it. She lists the different forms of compensation that are involved in any kind of work. Money, authority, status, honor, well-being. These are all the ways that we get compensated for our labor. And they're in flux, based on our specific context, our specific situation. What matters more? I've written before about the ways in which this comes to bear in the gendered work of librarianship, especially that idea of emotional labor. And while we shouldn't automatically think that in the academic context, money matters less than prestige, we should also note that even in industrial settings, and I'm thinking here about the kind of contract negotiations that labor unions are often involved with, we often see that work processes and grievance procedures carry more weight for the workers than the salary objectives. So another thing that you'll find when you start digging into this idea of invisible work is the way in which skills comes up. Skills are connected to invisible work because it goes hand in hand that the invisibility of labor processes is thought to be unskilled work. What is it that bothers us really? The lack of recognition. This is one of the areas that Arlene Daniels explained. She talked about validation as an important part of whether the worker herself sees her activities as work. And her example was the homemaker, who does a significant amount of labor that's worth wages if they existed for that. But she doesn't ever get the validation, the experience of having performed for someone to kind of understand that her work is work. So is it recognition that bothers us? Or is it the appearance of our work as unskilled labor? The underappreciation of our technical and intellectual capacities when our labor goes unrecognized as labor? As the US economy in particular has shifted to a service economy, with retail far outpacing manufacturing jobs, the notion of aesthetic labor has come to the fore of discussions on invisible work. Aesthetic labor, are people familiar with this term? It was fairly new to me, so, no? Okay. Aesthetic labor can be summed up by the phrase, you have to look right and sound right for the job. And the primary example here are retail workers at Abercrombie & Fitch, who are hired for their ability to model the brand. And Chris Warhurst has written about this, and what ends up happening as far as the work is concerned, according to Warhurst, is that the skills required are no longer attained through training or education. They are now ascribed to the worker by the employer, ushering in a regime of hiring discrimination that's based on race, class, ability, and gender that somehow magically falls outside of the regulatory framework that we've developed to protect workers. So there's also the long history of feminist inquiry into these concepts of visibility and invisibility, presence and absence. I think here of Audre Lorde's 1977 talk, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, in which she articulates the vulnerability that very often goes hand in hand with visibility. She notes that Black women especially are simultaneously highly visible when navigating mostly white spaces, yet also rendered invisible through the dehumanizing forces of a racist society. And in their 1999 article, which I highly encourage people to read, by Susan Leigh Starr and Anselm Strauss, called Layers of Silence, Arenas of Voice, the Ecology of Visible and Invisible Work. They approach the issue of invisible work from the perspective of an area of science and technology studies known as computer-supported cooperative work. So their emphasis is on modeling the different interactions that individual collaborators have with each other and with their own work, and thinking through how the technological systems we develop to facilitate this work can help or hinder the collaborations. So it gives a fantastic overview of the different conceptions of visibility and invisibility in a variety of work situations. And the framework that they develop is essentially one of foreground and background, with the worker and the work itself shifting back and forth. So you can have highly visible work done by invisible workers and so forth, like we saw in that visual. But I really love what they have to say about the drawbacks of visibility, or the ways in which invisibility can actually become a positive for workers. Sometimes positive invisibility comes with discretion and with not having to reveal your work processes to others. Some work is visible only to the worker, as it consists of local workarounds or routines they have developed privately at their desktops or elsewhere. We think of the example of nurses here, who, according to the article, they closely guard their autonomy, their ability, their room for discretion in their work, so that they may account for having counseled a dying patient, but they may not report the exact words that they use to do that. So think about the ways that we kind of want to keep a distance between our skill, our expertise, and we want to guard our professionalism. That's at play here. So we can go on for days discussing what work itself is. Context matters here too. This is Starr and Strauss again. Lacking a mutual context, all that is visible is the unadorned action. And I think that came up a lot yesterday, talking about how we translate between disciplines, between fields. You lose the context and it looks like unadorned action. You can't appreciate the work as intellectual work, right? So this is 1999. Go ahead and read that. So suffice it to say about work, that what gets valued as work often depends on who is doing the work, and of course in what context. As I said, I've written before about librarianship as a feminized profession, and the way in which the perception of women's work as naturally service, and therefore secondary to actual research in the academy, can hinder our collaborations with disciplinary faculty in the digital humanities. That would go for male librarians as well. They would also be hindered because of that. Labor historians have had to grapple with this reconceptualization of what counts as work by learning how to consider work inside the home, in the domestic sphere and informal economies. In addition to the more traditional unionized male factory worker. This is my favorite poster, by the way. In 1993, Alice Kessler Harris spoke of this need to insert gender into labor history by treating the male as other. And she specifically modeled this on the work of David Roediger's The Wages of Whiteness. And this brings me to one thing that I haven't heard so far at this symposium. Race and racism, and the ways in which our collaborations in the academy are shaped by it. Because guess what? Any kind of investigation into invisible work, even in the digital humanities, has to address race. And we've talked a whole lot about different kinds of hierarchies. We've acknowledged the different levels of risk involved for different professions, different career stages, different disciplines. But we need to also talk about the fact that this room is overwhelmingly white. And what is missing from our conversations because of that? Yesterday, Abby Scheel challenged Mark about the lone author scenario with the very question, could the project have been better with collaborators? And that's the question we need to be asking every day in the digital humanities when we have events like this. Who is missing from this room, and what are we missing because of that? It is so important when we discuss invisible work to be aware of who is doing the work and their relationship to visibility and invisibility, and how that intersects with the work that they're doing and the role they're playing. How can we speak of effective collaboration across hierarchies without also acknowledging the specific context in which we're doing this work? A situation in which people of color, queer folks, and others are marginalized in the academy and already burdened with disproportionate service responsibilities, all those diversity initiatives that get passed on to them. And for those who are also tenure-track faculty, they have an even shakier relationship with the prospect of tenure than what I assume is the default position of most of the people in this room. And this book actually just came out, which addresses this topic, so I'm giving a plug for this book edited by Patricia Matthew, Written Unwritten, Diversity and the Hidden Truths of Tenure. So how do these risks that we talked about yesterday multiply? How are they different depending on the physical spaces and the particular bodies we inhabit? In talking about invisible work, Adia Harvey-Wingfield and Renee Skeet have developed an idea of racial tasks, that's what they're calling them, to refer to the invisible work that people of color must perform in a primarily white workspace, which we can think of as the extra burden of translation, the code switching, the diversity explanations that get asked of them. Add this to the already too long list of care labor that these faculty do. Let's acknowledge all that extra mentoring, engaged pedagogy, and support work that is so vital to the success of students in our universities. And then let's talk about the invisible work involved in collaborative projects. How can we make our collaborative spaces and interactions more inclusive to people who are already marginalized in the academy? So my other concern with regard to the work laid out before us here at the symposium and beyond, extending into the white paper and other outputs that Paul and the organizers have discussed, is that I want to make sure that we don't think of credit solely as attribution. Instead of working towards real recognition, whatever that may be for the individual involved. I'm concerned that with a higher education system that is ever more focused on skills and metrics, a culture of assessment that is fast bleeding into surveillance of our students and our faculty, that the natural solution to the visibility problem is going to become a rigid system of attribution, an accounting procedure that does not address what we're ultimately after, which is that meaningful recognition and advancement of scholarship. Lawyers work in terms of billable hours. Is this the model that we really want to follow? I would argue that our goal is not simply to develop a precise system of attribution, but to develop that true recognition which may be different for different people. And for this, we need generosity. If that is the visibility we're after, we also need to document our work and to tell the story that we want to tell. Okay, so let's go back now to the 1930s, to Louis Hein and the FSA photographers. Their work was intentional, often staged, not a recording of life as it happened, but a statement of what life was like at that moment for those people. These photographers worked deliberately to construct a statement by pairing image and text together, sparingly. So why should we cultivate a documentary impulse in DH? We hear calls for creating documentation all the time. I don't have to repeat that today. Whether it's brief or long, we all know that we should do a better job of documenting our project. But for our purposes here with visibility and recognition, if we're aiming to make our work visible, we need to start by making it legible. We cannot rely on a system-generated brain dump to communicate what we are doing and building and working towards. This task requires thoughtful, deliberate, knowledgeable, and skillful modes of abstraction, interpretation, and critique. So while we should continue to talk about invisible work and invisible labor, all asked us for action items. And I'd like to work towards legibility as a kind of first goalpost. This doesn't mean removing all of the nuance or intellectual rigor from the work. It doesn't mean dumbing it down so that people can understand it, the public. What I mean by legibility is that we need to translate our work into those different contexts. Going back to the words from Starr and Strauss, lacking a mutual context, all that is visible is the unadorned action. How do we keep that context for the work we do once it leaves our hands? Documentation. But there's another aspect to cultivating a documentary impulse. When we talk about the issue of archival representation and libraries, we often look around for who's collecting in a certain area. So let's ask, who's collecting in DH these days? Where do you go for the latest, the best, the most comprehensive? Who has a really strong collection of DH material?
Stanford.
Who's collecting our stories, our contexts, our traces? What are we going to do with the DH Slack channel? We can look back at blog posts and compilations like the DH Debates book series. But wouldn't it be fun to look through a snapshot of the digital humanities hashtag on Twitter circa 2009? Amy Earhart has an article just out in Digital Studies in which she argues that DH is quote, a site of struggle for the future of the academy. Which is to say that this is not only disciplinary navel-gazing that I'm talking about. The kind of arrival and struggle over DH that's been going on for the last few years will be of real interest to scholars in the future, and I bet that we could learn something from it now if we had better reference resources, better DH collections that are not about projects. This is work that any of us can do. It doesn't take huge grant dollars to document what's going on. So we talk about preservation and sustainability to some degree for digital projects, but what are the other forms of evidence that we're left with when a project does die? Conference proceedings, blog posts, grant reports? Lisa Rohde has pointed out what a rich resource for DH history we have in those grant report, project write-ups, white papers that are produced during the administration of, for example, NEH grants. But how will we learn about the failures and struggles? Are those documents being entirely honest? It is extremely difficult to write about your own work critically and concisely. It's also extremely difficult to get people to write about DH without selling their project and their successes. This is why we need critics, reviews. We've probably all heard of Miriam Posner's How Did They Make That? It's had a lot of legs, right? Do we know about this? DH Commons has a new, the journal has a kind of column around this. And I love Miriam, but it's such a simple idea. Why didn't anyone else think to do this? And I think the reception is indicative of how much we want those simple explanations. What does the project do? What is it built on? Who was it made for? To make it legible to newcomers and those outside of the field. And also, how does the content fit the form? So, after railing against projects, I'm going to talk about projects. But these are not your usual digital projects. So this is something that I worked on. And I wasn't sure about talking about today, but I said, why not? It was a project developed between me and the digital scholarship librarian at the Graduate Center, Steve Zweibel. And what it's doing, it's kind of an experiment. So I'm the dissertation librarian. I work a lot with margins, page numbers, Arabian style, checking that the format is precisely set according to our guidelines. And we decided to play around with a kind of basic user documentation for a digital project if a dissertation had a digital component along with a written article. What we could do with that in Turabian style. So here's one sample that we made. We developed a few different components that would be required. So the same way that you have to include a list of tables and figures on your publication, you would also include a digital manifest. You can include a glossary of functions, a statement on technical requirements. And these are high-level abstractions. This is not the full system-generated documentation that you would have. This is speaking to the people who don't know anything about digital projects. This is speaking to future catalogers in the library who need to quickly see, what is this project? What does it include? So this is like a packing list. Okay, my dissertation is code, blog post, article, digital edition. We archived the website, so there's work files there too. But requiring students to kind of make this so that they're thinking about the documentation that they've made, and so that we have a better trace of what's in the dissertation. So, I'm going to talk about another project, despite the slide, and that's DH and Lib. It's actually mispronounced all the time. We chose a terrible name for this project, but we do go by DH and Lib, so we put that in our Twitter handle, but the plus was actually a design choice. I think at one point we had it with an at, it was DH at Lib, and we said, no, a plus looks better. We'll make it and. And that's the kind of story that's not documented anywhere. We are guilty of this as well. So DH and Lib is a collaborative project. It started out myself and Sarah Potvin at Texas A&M, and Zach Coble, who's at NYU, are the main site editors. And we have a lot of different collaborative editors and different kind of special project editors, as well as a very involved group of librarians who kind of donate their time as editors at large for what we call the DH and Lib review. That's modeled off of DH Now, that same rotating weekly sign-up of volunteer editors to kind of go through the literature of digital humanities and libraries and increase the visibility of librarians to the DH audience. We haven't documented it well. And we've already found in peer-reviewed articles stories of the genesis of the project that make no sense, that are completely wrong. At the time we say, where did they find it? We should have done a better job documenting it. So that's one part of the example. But the other part is that we're not really building anything, we're not really interested in building anything besides a community. And how are we thinking about that kind of project here? Is it all invisible work because it's community building? No, it's visible. But back to documentation. This was one idea that came to us through one of our contributing editors, Josh Hein at Northwestern. And it was this idea of documenting what's going on in the field. We call them scene reports. And they're still active, you can still do one. The very first one with Lori Allen, the coordinator for digital scholarship and services at Haverford College, but she is now at Penn, was the first person to be interviewed. So the idea is that you find somebody at your institution, you talk to them about DH. We gave 5 sample questions that you might want to talk about, but just to get a feel where people were talking about maybe there's different flavors regionally. You know, what are people working on without selling your project? And another activity, maybe I should call them activities, was just this past summer where we collaborated with the Global Outlook DH and the ADHO Libraries and DH SIG to conduct a translation hackathon. So when we're talking about invisible work, we talk about invisible labor, but we're talking about the work output as well. And how visible is all of the DH literature from non-Anglophone countries, right? So while we don't want to kind of reify English, we know that it's the English-speaking audience that needs to hear about this work that's going on in other languages. So we have been involved in how to build a multilingual DH and Lib. What does that look like? How do we do that? And that's not always a technical problem, and that's, I think, what was discussed. How do you distribute the labor? How do you get people to translate better than Google Scholar without just having massive volunteer contingents to do this? I want to close, before I close, with crediting a lot of this to my colleague, DH and Lib, John Russell. He was suggesting this idea, and I think it's a great one, and I think that we could maybe consider it here. Let's talk about what DH looks like without projects. We see a lot of this going on at some of the other, community college conferences, under-resourced institutions where they have to talk about the pedagogy, well, not that they have to talk about the things you can't do, the things you can do without money. So in closing, to hopefully just tie some of this together, my 3 X. Let me talk about, this last week. I have a lot of personal dystopias, but one that I'm going to focus on is involves a rigid system of automatic measurement, impact, and analytics through attribution and meticulous logging of work activity. Because what I've found as I've been working in the bureaucracy of the dissertation deposit and the degree processes, and dealing with incredibly anxious students at a very difficult time in their career, that the same space for individual discretion that allows corruption to seep through the space in our rules is the same space that allows compassion to flourish. And we desperately need compassion in our world today. We've heard a lot of calls recently from scholars and practitioners alike, including Stacey Williams, Fergus Jules, and of course, Bethany Nowitzki, to bring an ethic of care to our work. But there's little instruction in how to actually do this. So maybe that can be the next symposium. We talk about radical empathy, care as a radical act, and it seems in light of recent events that it is radical. But I want here to repeat something that I learned from listening to Jay Davis, who's also at CUNY, at the Theorizing the Web conference earlier this year. She said, "I don't like empathy. We think if we empathize, we understand, and we don't. I like compassion." And ever since I heard that, it has stuck with me. In all of our conversations, I don't know what you're going through. I can't possibly understand it, but I can have compassion and give you the space to be human. Our humanity lies not just in our eyes, our hands, our work, but in our hearts, our brains, our toes even. And the greatest challenge, the greatest thrill that I get from the digital humanities is not learning how to code or build or make tools, but in considering how our cultural heritage, the traces of our human memory, will transform and survive to inspire a new generation through generosity and compassion. Let us tell the story we want to tell, make it legible, and make it last.
Audio, film, and in public memory as mispronouncing DH and Lib. I'm never going to live this down. We have maybe a couple minutes for a couple of quick questions before our break.
Apologies for reading, but I read. Is that a hand?
It is a hand.
Yes.
I was wondering, I very much appreciate the documentary impulse that you called for us to include in the work that we do, and I agree completely. It's incredibly important. But as a genre, how do we avoid the fact that documenting is a process of exclusion, right? That it's a process of forgetting. Because I think you're right, so much of the work that happens within the scale of the digital humanities environment is invisible. And some of that work can be made more visible by a documentary impulse, but a lot of it will be made less visible. So if we come up with a great idea for a new kinds of commons one night while at a bar drinking, in our documenting of that, we decided to say, well, it really was, we forget all of those, minute conversations that led up to it, and we start with the official meeting that we had as a lab to discuss this together. There's still a process of forgetting and exclusion there, right? How do we tackle the idea that by creating official histories, we're effacing the unofficial histories that came before?
Very good question. I think that this is not necessarily a solution to that, but part of what I was hoping to call for was that we need to talk about each other's work and not just document our own. And there's not really a very good infrastructure right now for things like project reviews, for anyone who's going to really take a critical eye. It happens frequently within articles, if somebody writes an article about something and they take an example of a project and they tear it to shreds. That's useful, even though it's unkind. I feel like it's similar to the preservation question, right? Multiple copies in multiple places, multiple tellings. Yeah.
Well, and I would add that it may be becoming an act of inclusion by allowing other kinds of intellectual and emotional approaches. So it may not come out of a literature tradition. So maybe these are descriptive narratives instead of the critical evaluations, right? And that adds that extra piece of the story. So it's not an either or, right? It's another, as you say, another piece of the puzzle.
I think that means we need to thank Roxanne again and take a quick break. And we are, please help yourself to reflections that have been just wonderfully prepared and beautifully laid out. I think we have maybe just under 10 minutes for a break. And then the plan is to return to the same room where you were yesterday. If you joined us today, you were probably given a colored sticker on your name tag, which is in fact